Hey, everybody. We're here, alive and thrive in the world's most culturally diverse city, Toronto, home of Blue Jays, Raptors, Maple Leafs, and Canadian psychic Robert Lindsy Milne. That's me. Welcome to my side of the crystal ball. You know, every week I start off with saying, got an amazing guest tonight. Or what a fabulous show I've got for you tonight. Well, that's because they are. But tonight, and I always say this too, but tonight is really special. I've been waiting to meet Morgan Daimler for a long time. She's an expert, although she says she's not. And by the way, she's written 42 books about the topic of fairies, elementals, ghosts, and Irish folklore, as well as other worldly beings. I have been wanting to talk with someone about this subject because I've sensed the little people, and we'll be going through that as well. WWRS tonight, I'm going to be sharing with you one of the greatest tragedies I've ever went through and experienced. Not to get your empathy or your sympathy, but simply to share with you the lesson that when one door closes, another one opens. What we do one way, we must do equally the opposite. When there's a tragedy, there is always the opportunity to experience the other way as well. And it's this tragedy, as well as the way I handled it, the opportunity and the success of the opportunity has lasted 20 years. And I'd like to share that part with you on WWRS. Before we get started, though, I have a few requests. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Subscriptions are really important. That will get us more recognition, and we're going to be able to do more shows. That gets us higher ratings. You can also find, oh, by the way, don't forget to like and comment too. You can find us on Apple, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere else you get your podcasts. If you'd like to get in touch with me personally, you can find me on my website, www.robertlindsymilne.com. In case you want to have a reading or life coaching or have a conversation, you can find me there. You can also find me on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And now, without further ado, here comes WWRS. Everybody I've ever met, no matter how good or bad their life is, we all go through crises. We all go through problems. We all go through difficult times. And one of the things that is absolutely true about every crisis, difficulty, and problem that we've been through, we've always survived it. We've always sorted it out, and we almost always get on with our lives. It may not be the same life. It'll be different, but it'll be our life, and it will be good, and it can be happy too. Dogs came late for me in life. I didn't get a dog till I was about 48 years old. And at the time, I decided I wanted a little puppy, and I found her, and her name, we gave her the name as Tilly. Well, originally it was Matilda, then we shortened it to Tilly. As I said, I was about 48 when we first got Tilly as a puppy. And on the very first morning that she was with us, she came into my workroom and she let me know that she was going to be a part of my work for as long as she was around. I'd never had a dog before. It was a special experience. I'd never had that kind. And one of the things that was very special about her was it was the first time in my life I'd been experiencing unconditional love. Never had that before. It was a beautiful time. Tilly became very bonded with me. She became my 24-hour, 7-day-a-week companion. I took her with me everywhere, almost everywhere, almost every time. And it was because I just loved having her with me. If I had friends and I was invited out and they'd say, gee, you can't take your dog, I'd say, okay, that's fine. And I wouldn't go. If people came to me for readings and they were uncomfortable with my dog, I would apologize to them and I would refer them to a friend of mine who I knew would be a good reader, psychic, and wouldn't need to have a dog with them. So to make a long story short, I almost never let anyone look after Tilly. And then there was this one night in February of 2002. I had a business meeting in Toronto. At the time, I was living outside the city. I was working in Toronto and I had Tilly with me and I couldn't bring her to the business meeting. So I took her home to my home outside of Toronto. And she was going to be left alone with the cats for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 hours. One of my friends, the next door neighbor, said, you know, Robert, if you'd like, you know, Tilly can come and stay with us for the next few hours, and then you can pick her up when you get home. And I thought that would be good because she'd like that. Lo and behold, Tilly, when I left, Tilly got out, got hit by a car, had a broken back, and ultimately it killed her. It was one of the deepest and most painful experiences that I'd ever gone through. Now, at that time, it was a really terrible time anyway, but I went through one of the most painful experiences, the loss of my dog. It was quite devastating, and I had a lot of trouble getting past it. The first few weeks without her, not having her by my side, made life very difficult. I got to the point where, while I was so hurting so much because I had lost my dog and my work partner, and at the same time, I was going through a lot of stuff and it was a difficult time. I lost my first dog by a tragedy. My life had changed and I was hurting a whole lot. I got to the point where it interfered with how I was able to function and live, and how I was able to deal with my clients and even work. In a moment of pain, I reached out to a breeder and I asked if she had any golden retriever puppies. And then when I told her what happened to my dog, and I started to cry on the phone, she talked with me for a little bit. She then said, you know, we don't have any puppies right now. If you had one, we would give you one. We have an older dog and she's been living with us in the house. This is now, this, by the way, is a very prominent and famous big breeder in Canada. Well, actually, it's in North America. And I just found her online. And in my talking with her, she said, you know, we have a dog and she lives with us in the house and she's been with us for a long time. She's a very special dog and her name is Kindred Spirit. And while we don't have a puppy that we could give to you, because we don't have any yet, they're a few months away. I really think that Kindred might be the type of dog that you need right now. She said, look at her on my website. If you like what she looks like, call her back and then come on up and see if you like her and see if she bonds with you. And again, to make a long story short, a couple of days later, I drove out to the farm. And I went to the farm, went to the woman's house with her family there. And meeting me at the door were 6 of the most beautiful golden retrievers I'd ever seen. It was just stunning. I knew that Kindred was one of those. I just didn't know which one. I sat down and was talking with the family, and this dog came up to me. I started to pat this dog. Anyway, when it came time, I asked the woman, which dog, by the way, is Kindred, because they were all so beautiful. And she said, oh, the one that just came up to you and the one that you're patting. Kindred came home with me that night, that day. The hurting in my heart didn't stop from the loss of Tilly, but getting Kindred started making me feel a little bit better. As time wore on, we adopted, and Kindred became very close with me, just as Tilly had been. Kindred was 7 when she came to me, and she gave me 6 3/4 years. They were beautiful. And she made it to just a little bit before, or just before her 14th birthday. She got sick with cancer and completed her life. And once again, I was without a dog. I contacted Keon Kennels again and asked them, did they have a puppy? And they said, well, actually, they're all spoken for, but you know, if you're interested in like another dog, we have a dog here, and her name is Dixie, and her registered name was Keon's last waltz, Dixie dog. I used to call her Dixie dog. When I met Dixie, she was 5.5, and she was the most beautiful dog. I just couldn't believe it. And she bonded with me like I've never had a dog bond with me before. Kindred did, just as Tilly did. Dixie was different, and she was really, really close. Dixie came to me on the condition that I would bring her home to the breeder so that she would have one more litter, and then she'd be completely mine. I really enjoyed the process of being involved with the dog breeding, just even though it was just my dog. I asked them, Karen and Wally, the owners of Keon Kennels, if there was ever a time they had a younger puppy, a younger dog, that I could be a co-owner with to, to bring her home for showing and breeding, and let me know. A couple of weeks later, I got a call and saying, we have this dog and her name is Tessa. And Tessa is 8 months old, and she's a very sensitive dog and would do much better in a family home than in a kennel life. And a couple of days later, Tessa came home with Dixie and I. I stayed close with the people at Keon Kennels. I was very grateful to them for being so generous with me. I kept in touch. I came up to see them. I brought the dogs up. And Karen and Wally and family started noticing that I was handling the dogs pretty well, even though I was, later in life, and my dogs were doing very well. They suggested that I could get interested. Might want to get interested in dog training and dog handling. So for over a year or two, they started sending dogs down for me to train, practice training, and for socializing and things like that. And I think the dogs were training me too. And over the years, over the past several years with Keon Kennels, there have been more than 20 dogs that have come down and stayed with me for training and showing. Dixie got sick. It was time for her to go. And when she did, I just wanted to have another dog. And then Lacey came to stay with me. Lacey was almost 18 months old. Lacey went into showing and training. And then Tyson came to stay with me. Again, all from Keon Kennels. They liked the way I handled the dogs. They liked the way I looked after dogs. They thought I was talented. I would have been a lot better if I started when I was like in my 20s as opposed to in my 50s and 60s. If Tilly hadn't have died, so tragically, I would not have reached out to Karen at Keon Kennels. Oh, by the way, it was February 21st, 2002, that Tilly tragically died. And here we are now in April of 2022, 20 years later. And because of how I reached out, because I opened my heart, and because when one door closes, the other door opens. But the key is you gotta walk through the door. In that 20 years, more than 20 dogs came to stay with me for training, and just because I like to have them around, and training and socializing, as well as kindred spirit, Tessa, Lacey, Tyson, and a beautiful old girl named Christy Kringle, who came and stayed with us when she was 16. All those dogs, kindred spirit, Dixie, Tessa, Lacey, and Tyson. I trained them all, took them to school, and I myself led them to reaching their rally obedience titles, all 3 dogs, as well as all the dogs that came to stay with me. One dog died. And I reached out, and I've had 20 years of joy. People also say, the good Lord helps those that helps themselves. And it's true. The tragedy happened. I reached out and I did something, and I started the ball rolling in our direction. Yes, when bad things happen, good things will happen eventually. But you have to do the work. Reach out, take a step. It always works out. And that's what Robert has to say. My guest, Morgan Daimler, is graciously agreed to come and share her knowledge and her experience writing 42 books. I am really blown away by that. Morgan, welcome to my side of the crystal ball.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So you're an expert or extremely knowledgeable in Irish folklore, fairies, elementals, ghosts, and other worldly type beings. Is that?
Yeah, I prefer extremely knowledgeable. I think expert is a hard thing to achieve.
Is it? Okay.
I think so.
Well, your segment is called The Expert's Chair, and you're sitting in it tonight. So
okay, I'll accept it for today then.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, what got you interested in little people, fairies, and ghosts, and things like that?
Sure. I mean, for myself, I think it was a blend of, I've always had experiences that people would consider sort of outside the normal range, which would include things like ghosts and fairies, and and this is going back to my childhood. And then I also, I grew up at least partially within the Irish American diaspora, and there's a lot of beliefs with that.
Excuse me, just Irish. And what was the second word you said?
American.
Irish American.
Diaspora.
That word.
Yep, diaspora. It's basically the community of people who are immigrants who immigrated over from Ireland. In this case, there's also a pretty good Irish Canadian diaspora, as I'm sure you know.
Yes.
Yes.
There's a wee bit of Irish in me too. I think it's about 30+%.
Yeah, it's pretty common. The Irish, especially when the whole the famine had happened in the 19th century, there was a lot of people going to new places.
Absolutely.
And particularly Canada and the US and Australia. So
when
you get
you
a lot
were,
of that.
Yeah. So when you were a little girl, did you see fairies?
I did.
Or things? By the way, what is a fairy?
That is an excellent question. And that actually is why I tend to not refer to myself as an expert, because it's such a huge subject.
Okay.
I think you can study it for a lifetime and still only know a small fraction
Sure.
of what there is to know. Because when we're talking about fairies, most people picture that very specific sort of image of like the little Tinkerbell kind of fairy.
Right.
But fairy itself, the word, has been used for hundreds and hundreds of years back through the 13th century, pretty much for any being that's otherworldly, that comes from the world of fairy.
Oh.
Yeah, so we have this huge range. There's fairy hounds, there's fairy horses, there's human looking fairies, there's shapeshifters. It's really encompasses quite a lot of different types of beings.
So they're actually horse fairies and dog fairy, well, cats and
Yep. Yep, fairy
okay.
cats. Cat she is what they're called in the Irish, or the Scottish is very similar. Big black cats, they're like the size of a dog, and they have a white spot on their chest.
Wow.
Yeah.
Are they tangible or are they spiritual?
In the traditional folk beliefs, they're generally seen as being tangible,
Wow.
but it's it's one of those fascinating subjects. I should also say that one of the big things that got me as deeply into this as I am
Yes.
is that I really do find the entire topic completely fascinating. There's so much to it, and there's so many layers to it. So, talking about our fairies tangible, we have all these stories where they clearly are. They interact physically with people, they move things, they're clearly interacting with our world. But then we also have stories where, they can become like smoke and go through the knothole in a door or the keyhole in a door. And they seem to be able to sort of decide if they want to be tangible or not.
So they can be invisible if they want to be.
Yes.
Oh, that's answering a lot of questions for me.
Yeah. Yeah. I like to tell people that the first thing to remember about fairies is that for every definitive statement, there's a contradiction. Like it's,
Kind of like people too, isn't it?
yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Um,
Are they so are they similar to us, or are they, like all the that we see on the planet we're connected to? Are we also connected with them, or are they a totally different species on the planet that are different than us?
I think the answer to that is yes and no. Um, I think that they're definitely something that is not human in nature.
Okay.
And that's a lot of times in the stories where we see problems happening between humans and fairies. It's because they're very different in how they approach things, and their thought process, I think, can be hard for humans to understand. But they also seem to be very intrinsically connected to humans, to the human world. Going back as far as we have written accounts of them, there's this dependence that they seem to have on us, with us, and we also seem to have to some degree with them. They inspire us, they inspire our imaginations, they teach us not to go
how,
into the dark woods at night.
how would they be dependent upon us?
In a couple different ways.
Yeah.
We have a lot of stories of fairies borrowing things from humans, particularly technology. So the idea that when humans come up with a great new idea, like the hand mill was a big thing in like the 17th and 18th century. And then we see stories of fairies borrowing those to use for themselves. And midwives are another, not really a thing because it's a person, but a professional that would get borrowed, because it's said that fairies have a much lower birth rate than humans do. So when you have a fairy that's going to have a baby, they don't really have a specialist for that. So they would go and find a human midwife, and that person would then be brought in to do the work, and then returned to the
So
human
would
world.
that be on the, so does the midwife agree to that, or do they just all of a sudden appear and help birth the baby, or is it an agreement?
It's usually they don't usually know that it's a fairy, but
Oh,
a stranger would appear to them and say, "Oh, my wife is, you know, having a baby. I need you to come help." And so the midwife would get all her equipment, what she needed, and she would go.
oh,
And
this is a long time ago. This isn't
um,
like in 19 or
even
2000, right? Really?
even more recently, most of the stories we have that are in
Yes.
writing are a little older, but there is a story from Wales where the fairy and the midwife take a bus. So it's actually one of my favorites because the mental image is fabulous. But yeah, so we do have them in more recent times. And the idea, the midwife then goes through this whole process to get to the woman and helps deliver the baby, and usually at some point around then figures out that it's not, a normal circumstance, we'll just say. And in some cases, like there's an ointment they want to put on the baby's eyes, and they tell her, like, make sure you don't touch your own eyes, and she does, and then she can see truly, she can see what they really are,
Ooh.
because they have a lot of illusion magic.
So then what happens to that? Like, does the midwife get into trouble for that?
Depends on whether she kind of lets them know. If she
Ah,
lets them know that she can see them, then usually, yeah, they're not too happy about that. If she kind of plays it smart and pretends that nothing has changed, then she goes on and then tells the story. I mean, she tells the story either way, obviously, because that's how we get the stories. But um,
oh, so then there would also be those folklores, and maybe there would be, if you ever come across a fairy or whatever, and you can see them, don't let on. That would be,
yes,
oh, okay, that
yes,
would be
that
common knowledge from those eras.
yeah, that's actually one of the widespread kind of traditional beliefs, particularly in Ireland and Scotland, is that the fairies can pass invisibly around humans, so they can be around us and we might not see them. And they like their privacy. They prefer that. They don't necessarily want to be seen. So when you can see them, it's usually better, according to the folk beliefs, not to make a big deal out of seeing them, because sometimes they can get upset by that. You're better off just be like, okay.
I'm not sure if you read one of the emails that I sent to you about my experience with what I call little people,
Mhm.
and I really have to share this with you because I lived in an area, and it's in Toronto, and Toronto, by the way, is a very green city, incidentally, and we have an area called the Don Valley, and where I was living is in the East Don Valley, and there's a creek that's running through it, and when you walk through the Don Valley, you feel like you're in the middle of the wilderness.
Mhm.
And once upon a time, it was that. Although it's now a place where people walk, and I would walk my dogs through that area, and I always just sensed that there was other beings around me. I could feel it, and I could sense them um, looking at me or knowing that I was there. And I wasn't feeling particularly stressed about it. I was just sensing the energies. It was other life forms.
Mhm.
um, One day I was walking with a friend, and there was this great big tree. I guess it had been hit by lightning because there was a hole at the bottom
Mhm.
of the tree, right? And as we were walking by, I said to my friend Ruth, that's where the little people live. And she looked at me like I was crazy. And as I was walking around, this was over a few years. One time I sensed them, and I just said out loud, I know you're there, and I can feel you, and I wish you no ill. And then I just kept walking. So as time went on, I was feeling them more and more. And there was one time I was walking on the pathway, and there was a branch across the pathway, and I thought, they sit there and watch us walk by. and I kind of saw a form, and as I was walking by, I said hello. And then I started getting information from them. And they were telling me, or he was telling me, that their home has been destroyed by the people, the expansion, and that they're really sad, and that they have to leave the area. And I had those kind of conversations, but I haven't told anybody before. Is that kind of like the experience?
I mean, that's definitely, a lot of that is in line with things that we see in folklore.
Okay.
They're often very connected to trees.
Okay.
That's a whole thing that we could talk about, the idea of fairy trees.
Okay.
And then the idea that they do sometimes just take a liking to a person. A lot of times when I talk about them, I tend to emphasize that people need to be cautious, more because there is so much of that sort of Disney idea of fairies. And so people tend to treat them a little lackadaisically, I guess we'll say. So I try to emphasize, like, no, they are powerful and you do want to be a little careful with them. But sometimes they just like a person.
It
And if
seems
they
so.
like you, yeah, that's what it sounds like. If they like you, then they're gonna choose
Oh, their
to
leader
be around you
died.
and interact with you.
Now I remember,
Mm,
their leader or their boss or whoever died, and they were really upset about that.
mm. Yeah. Generally it's thought that fairies, any type of fairy, are fairly immortal, but they can be killed, they can die in various ways. So we do have accounts of that. It does happen. Um, and certainly it sounds like there was a lot of disruption going on
Well,
with their
their land
home.
was,
So
yeah, the trees were getting cut down, and people were walking through where they used to be their land. They actually put a paved, walkway through their area.
yeah,
I was having these conversations, and I wasn't telling anybody because I thought, even though I am a psychic, right? But that is my job. But
yeah,
but I was I have never talked with anybody about this
yeah.
much.
No, I understand. For a long time, I wasn't really very open about my own experiences, but as I slowly kind of started to talk more about my experiences, and particularly I started writing more about fairies in particular, I had a lot of people coming to me, usually in private, and sharing stories. And I started to realize this is actually fairly common, not necessarily as in depth as what you'd encountered, but people seeing them, people hearing them, people experiencing them. But I think there's such a stigma with it, even more so than like with ghosts and with other sort of phenomena, and even intuitive abilities. There's just this idea, particularly with fairies, because they're so strongly associated now in mainstream culture with children, and with being sort of this childlike thing that, when you're an adult and you're talking about seeing them and encountering them, or having conversations with them, people are very quick to dismiss that. And so there's this hesitancy to sort of put it out there. And I just made a decision, like, I'm just going to be open and put my experiences out there, because I think that we can normalize it and help other people to realize that these things do happen, and that they are not scientifically provable necessarily at this point, but much like ghosts, much like a lot of the different phenomena that people encounter, it's very widespread. A lot of people have these experiences. And the only way we're going to, you know, make that more acceptable is for more people to talk about it, and that it becomes more acceptable, I think.
What was your first fairy experience that I can identify?
The first one that I remember happened when I was probably about 5 years old. And there might have been others. When you're really little, your
Yes, of
memory is an
course.
interesting thing. But when I was about 5 years old, I distinctly remember, because this is one of those memories, there's a strong emotion with it. My bedroom at the time was facing the road, and there was a tree out front, and the way the street lights would hit it, I would get shadows on the wall in my room, and it was very scary, when
Yep.
you're little.
Yep.
And I didn't share a room with my sister. I was by myself.
Yep.
So I would get afraid at night, and I wasn't in the sort of family situation where you get up and you go get your mom when you're scared. Like, you stay in your bed.
Right.
And I can remember very vividly this woman with red hair sitting next to me and soothing me when I was crying and telling me it was going to be all right. And that, it was just shadows, things like, things you would say to it like a 5-year-old child. But she wasn't like a ghost. She wasn't a spirit. Like, she was tangible. She was physically present. And I didn't realize at the time that she was a fairy, obviously, because I was 5.
Yes.
But I think as I got a little older, I started to understand, and I started to realize that some of the things that I saw and interacted with, other people didn't believe in. I was building fairy houses when I was little. When I was like 8 or 9, I would write letters and put them on the windowsill for the fairies. I don't know
Did
why
they
I
take
started
them?
doing that. As far as I remember, they did. Although
Really?
I can't,
Yeah.
I can't
Okay.
swear that it wasn't like,
The wind
yeah,
or an
something
adult.
else.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. At that age,
Of
but
course.
but I remember I very vividly believed, and I was lucky enough in my childhood to grow up in a family that didn't discourage that.
Okay.
A lot of kids, especially as you get a little older, the people around you, the adults around you, start to say, well, this is childish, or that's not really real. And I was just lucky that my family was very accepting of all of this. And maybe it's because we did have that heritage that kind of said that this is a possibility. These things are out there. Maybe it was just because my parents appreciated, that there was a little more going on in the world than what people might always see. But it meant that I grew up having these beliefs, and never, not until I was much older, I will say, because I have in my life definitely encountered people who do not use nice words for the fact that I believe these things, but not growing up. Growing up, it was different.
Well, what happens when you talk about fairies or little people or other worldly beings? Do you think that let's change the question. Calling them worldly beings implies that there's something bestial or low about them, and I don't think they are they? I think they're equals.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
that they're just different from
Right.
humans. I mean, we certainly do have examples, particularly with the ones that shapeshift, where they'll take on animal forms, and they'll
They're equal in
can
that
be
they
that way.
have the right to exist and function and thrive and survive, right?
Oh yeah,
That's what I
I
was
would agree.
saying. Yeah.
Yeah, and they're definitely sentient. I mean, you can have conversations with them, as you were
I
just
think
talking
so.
about.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have a lot of stories of them where they can be very close with humans. So there clearly is that ability to communicate and to interact in a way that's very equal in that sense. Yeah, for sure.
Okay. Well, this is really fascinating.
It's a great topic.
It is. So an elemental is not a fairy. Is that correct?
In my opinion,
Oh,
I will.
well, You're in the expert's chair,
Yeah,
so
yeah. Well, I always try to be
okay.
fair that there are
Okay.
different viewpoints out
Of
there.
course,
And
I like yours right now.
thank you. The elemental subject in particular in the last, I would say 5 to 10 years has been starting to get a little muddled with fairies. It used to be, I'm going to make myself sound so old when I say this. It used to be back in the day, which would be like the 1990s, that it was a very clear distinction. Elementals were beings that were directly connected to an element. So you have a fire elemental,
Right.
might be in a bonfire, or you
Yeah.
might see it in your fireplace, and
Right.
water elementals would be in the water. And that was sort of how you understood them and experienced them. But it seems to be a term in the last, again, 5 to 10 years that people are starting to apply to different types of fairy, what we would call fairy beings. I don't know if it's sort of a crossover with the idea that a lot of people feel like fairies are nature spirits and elementals kind of get connected into that. Like, things just get very confusing. I tend to see them as very distinct. If there's an elemental somewhere, I see it as something that's kind of the embodiment of an element, the earth, the air, fire, water. Whereas fairies are very liminal beings. They're beings that exist between things. So, even when we talk about,
They exist between things. Well, what do you mean that? But what does that mean? I'm not being
liminal,
aggressive. It's just
no.
what does being in
Oh no,
between? What are the things
it's
that
a
were
great
in
question.
between? Right.
It's a
Okay.
great
Thanks.
question.
Thanks.
I think they're in between a lot of things.
Okay.
I mean, in between physical reality and
Okay.
intangible reality, in
Sure.
between our world and the other world, the world, their place, the world of fairy, in between our perception, our
Yes.
ability to perceive
Okay.
them.
Okay.
It's funny because when we talk about fairies, it's often said you're most likely to see them at liminal times, transitional times, dawn, dusk, twilight, because these are times that aren't completely one thing or another. And that's sort of the nature of fairies as well. They're hard to pin down because they're a little bit of a couple things.
Okay.
And that's what I was going to say, is that when we're talking about the difference between like fairies and elementals, when people talk about fairies, they would associate with, say, water fairies. They can be connected to water, they can primarily live in water, but they're not contained within it or limited to it or the embodiment of it, and they can come out of it if they choose to. So the sorts of fairies that we see described as being in the water, selkies, which are seal people, they look like seals in the water, and humans when they come on land.
Really?
Yep. Even the Irish and the Scottish, what we would call mermaids, although it's a little misleading, but the Irish and the Scottish version, in Iceland they call them fin folk. They can come out. They usually need some kind of magical object to do it, like a hat with a red feather is one you see in folklore, but they can come out of the water and exist on land. So they have that
Are
ability
they
to sort
water
of
breathing or air breathing?
both. They can be both.
Okay.
Which again is where we get that sort of liminality, that in-betweenness. They can exist under the water and be underwater beings, talking about the finfolk or the marrows, the mermaids, but then they can come out of water and be very human-like. I had mentioned fairy horses earlier. There's a particular type of being. It's literally called a water horse in Irish or Scottish. Ishiski is the Irish word. And they look like a horse, but they live in the water. So picture a horse, but living underneath the water in a lake.
I'm thinking.
Yeah, but they can come out of the water, and they can walk around on land, and they can also take on a human appearance. So it's all this very transitional, fluid, I guess is a good way to put it.
Do they look like a horse when they're in the water?
Yeah.
And they're swimming underwater and it's like a horse? And that would be a shock if you were a scuba diver, wouldn't it?
It would. It
You know,
would.
okay.
That would be a story to share for sure.
So when they're coming out of the water, do they swim out until their feet touch the ground and then they walk out? Is that what happens?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
The water horse is one of the sort of types of fairies that you definitely want to avoid for the most part, because they're predatory. They'll eat like sheep and cows and
Really?
humans.
And humans too.
And humans,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow.
So a lot of the folklore with them is they
These
come on
things.
land and they look like a horse, and so a person will sort of get
Oh, but
tempted
they're
into
not
riding them.
really a horse. They're
Right.
okay. I
And
got it. Right.
the person gets on them thinking, I'm going to ride this nice looking horse, and then the water horse, kelpie is another name for them, takes off and jumps into the water with the person, and then the person never is seen again.
Yeah, and it's in a person's lunch, right?
Yeah, basically.
Do they share that, or is that just like a one-off? Like that's mine and I eat it, or do they eat together?
There's one account that I've come across in Ireland where it was definitely a group of them. In this case, it was a horse that they ate. I don't know if you want to consider it like cannibalism with fairies, but no, water horses ate a not water horse, regular earth horse.
Sure.
But yeah, they it got pulled into the water, and there were several of them in the account. So usually they're described as solitary, but we do sometimes see them in groups. So maybe a little like wolves. Compare them to.
Okay. Wow. I've never heard of this before. That's really.
Like I said, there's so much to it, and there's so many stories, and there's so many different types of beings that fall into this this range. And my personal focus tends to be Irish, but we have these types of beings in Ireland, Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, England, France, similar types.
Is the Loch Ness monster one of those types, or is this different?
There's a lot of debate about that.
Okay.
There's actually an ongoing debate / conversation with cryptids in general. Cryptids being like the animals that aren't scientifically proven animals. Loch Ness, chupacabra.
A chupacabra? What is a chupacabra?
Chupacabra is folk belief we find, I think, more in like the southern US and in Mexico. Literally means goat sucker, but it's supposed to like drink the blood of goats, hence the name. And it's like a small, kind of goblin-y looking little animal. And it's one of those things where it's like some people say, this could be a type of fairy based on how it's described and how it acts. And other people say, no, it's an animal. It's just not one that we've scientifically proven, which, I mean, to be fair, scientists do discover new animals fairly regularly. We have such as much as we like to think that we have completely explored the world and we know everything.
No, we haven't.
Yeah, not even close. And especially if we talk the oceans, like not even a fraction.
Right.
But even on land, they still are finding new species and new plants and new things. So that's sort of the argument with cryptids is it just an animal that we haven't documented yet? Or is it something otherworldly? Is it something like a fairy that has something of the what we would, I guess, call supernatural to it? So yeah, it's really interesting discussion.
On another point of view, certain religious groups, Christian groups, refer to people like us as worldly beings. By the way, I might just want you to, incidentally, in the same category as the spirits and the fairies and
nothing wrong with that. Yeah, I actually enjoy looking at the Christian folklore around fairies, because you have this belief that sort of predates Christianity coming in, but there was obviously something to it. There was enough to it that they couldn't just dismiss it. People wouldn't stop believing it. So they had to kind of try to find a way to fit it in.
Oh, you're going to say then they became angels?
And yep, in Ireland,
Oh,
they're
you're not, you just see
often
that. Yeah, you just blew my beliefs in angels. Thanks a lot. Great. Boy, I'm glad we did this one.
yeah. I don't necessarily think they
I'm
are
teasing.
angels, but
Okay, good. I'm just playing.
yep. I love that, like, the way they did it was to be like, well, they're, we have heaven and the angels, which are good, and we have
Oh,
hell and the
right,
demons that are
right,
bad. And
right,
now we have fairies. And we have to kind of try to figure out, like, how is
where
this
do
going
they
to
fit?
work?
Right.
Right. So, in places like Ireland, more Catholic places, they sort of look at them as angels that were not bad enough to go all the way, if you see what I'm saying. But they're
Right.
not good enough to still be in heaven. They're kind of in
Right.
this middle
Okay.
zone.
Okay.
In some other places, particularly some of the more Protestant areas, they are seen as kind of demons. They're just demons who aren't quite as bad as the other ones.
Okay.
But it creates this really interesting, when you look at it, like, there's obviously something so profound to the idea of fairies that it couldn't just be written away, or you couldn't just convince people not to believe in them. Even over generations and hundreds of years, that they persist. So they just had to be fit in. You just had to find a way to make it work in this belief system that doesn't really make sense with that.
So there isn't a specific look of a fairy. They can be many different things or appearances.
Yep.
Okay.
Even the ones that look fairly human, they can be the smaller end accounts are like 18 inches tall. There's some that are like 7 to 8 feet tall. It's this whole very wide range. There's even some that are said to be extremely tiny, like insect sized, although that's a little less common in the folklore. But it's really this whole range. And some of them could pass for human. You could walk by one right now without necessarily, I mean, you would probably know. I think people who are more intuitive and more in tune with things would probably sense that something wasn't right. But a lot of people would just walk by them and not notice. And then you have others that are clearly something's going on. In some of the folklore, it's things like tails or hollow backs, or the sorts of
Okay.
things that humans wouldn't have.
Oh, okay. So tails or hollow
Hollow
back?
backs.
What's a
Yep.
hollow back?
In particularly like Swedish and Norse mythology, there's a particular type of being. They're called hulda folk, which just means hidden folk. But it's said that from the front they look very human, but from the back, their back is like hollow, like it's carved out.
Okay.
And that's supposed to be a way to like tell, if you're not sure, try to look at
Okay.
them from the
Okay.
back, or
Okay.
and then obviously humans don't work that way.
Right. So what's a black-eyed child, or what's that? Or
That is a great question. The black-eyed children, it's a newer phenomena. It's something I think people have been reporting over like the last 20 years. I'm spacing a little on when the first story started coming out. And there's a lot of debate, because it's newer, over exactly what they are. I tend to fall into the camp, probably to no one's surprise, that they are probably a type of fairy, because they fit a lot of the qualifications when it comes to fairies. Black-eyed children, just for anyone who's not familiar with them, are usually a pair of children. Sometimes it's a single one, but usually it's a pair, who are said to be very pale. They have completely black eyes. They're often wearing white.
all their eyes are black, or just their pupil, or sorry, just their
the
irises?
pupil and the iris.
Okay.
The iris are black.
Right, because that'd freak me out if somebody had black eyes, whether it would be white, right?
Yes. Yeah.
They
So
wouldn't get in my house.
that would stand out a little bit more.
You think, eh?
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, the pupil and the iris are completely black.
Okay.
And they usually are said to be wearing all white, or very close to that. clothing that's often said to be a little out of step. So if you're seeing them now, they'd be dressed like someone from like the 1990s.
Huh.
If you were seeing them in the year 2000, they would be dressed like someone maybe from like 1970. Not enough that it really, like, it's not someone from like 1700
Of course. Right.
archaic, but just enough that it's a little strange. Like, you wouldn't expect to see a child today dressed like that.
Right.
And they will usually approach someone either in their house or in a car and ask for help. But with the stories I've read, they usually seem very emotionless or not particularly upset, even though they're children. It's often they're seen at night, and they're saying that they need help or they need to make a phone call, is what they'll often say when they knock on people's doors for houses. And there's something very off about them. Like, the people who've had encounters with them kind of talk about how they immediately felt very uneasy or nervous or like a cold chill. Like, they don't feel like they're around children who need assistance, basically. And usually what happens is the people refuse to help them, and then in some cases they disappear. In some cases it kind of escalates and they sort of refuse to leave and continue, but talking about what they could be. Some people even connect them to vampires because of the asking to come in. Some people connect them to other types of phenomena like aliens, but they definitely check off a lot of the things we would look for with fairies. Fairies are often described as wearing things that are out of date, out of fashion, and not, again, like something that would be hundreds of years ago, but just enough that it seems odd. The all black eyes isn't something I've particularly found in folklore with fairies, but again, we do see the stories where they have something about them: tails, hollow backs, backwards feet in some of the stories. So the all black eyes does kind of fit in with that. And then the idea that they can't come in unless they're invited. People don't usually associate that with fairies, but that is something we see with certain types of fairies, particularly if there's like protection on the home of some type. There's also an issue when it comes to fairies sometimes where they want you to agree to something so that they can kind of get their foot in the door, if you will. So, they ask you for help, they ask you to be let in. And once you let them in, it's hard to say what they're going to do from there.
What does happen after that? Or what have you heard?
I actually haven't run across any black-eyed children stories where the person lets the children in. And I'm not sure how we should interpret that. It seems like the people telling the stories are the ones who did not let them in.
Right.
The closest I've come, and it wasn't exactly a black-eyed child story, but I did run across a story where it was like 2:00 in the morning. They had some friends over, so everyone was still awake, and they were like in the living room talking, and someone knocked on the door, and they went to the door, and it was a woman, but it's total stranger, and they were kind of out in the woods a little bit. And she wanted to come in, and the woman said no, because again, just felt uneasy. And then she asked, the woman at the door asked if she could have some honey, which is a very strange request at 2 a.m. to a total stranger. But for whatever reason, the woman who lived there was like, yeah, wait here, I'll get it for you. And brought it out and gave it to her and then closed the door. And then from the story accounts, the woman was gone. They never saw her leave. She just seemed to disappear. But the next morning when she went out, the woman who lived there, she found a tin whistle, which is a kind of, it's not quite like a flute, but it's somewhat similar. It's usually made of copper, on her welcome mat on the front of the door. So it's not exactly a black-eyed child story, but it's to me, it's very similar. And it definitely fits with the idea with fairies is reciprocity is a big thing. If you give them something, they're going to give you something. They always sort of pay back but they almost never pay back exactly the same way. Like if you give them honey, they're not going to give you honey in return. But it'll be something of equal value from their perspective. So, in my opinion, I think the black-eyed children definitely have enough qualifications that they could probably be considered a type of good folk, a type of fairy.
This is an amazing subject.
It is. I could talk about this forever because there's so much.
It seems so. Well, if I'm privileged enough, sometime you'll have to come back and talk some more, because this has been a fabulous discussion.
Definitely. I would love to come back sometime.
If people were interested in finding your books or being involved in a course or a group, how would they go about doing that?
Sure.
How do people find you?
I am sadly everywhere on social media, much to my own sadness anyway. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and that's all under my name, Morgan Daimler. My books, as we were discussing a little right before we started the show, I have some fiction. I have quite a bit of nonfiction. I do some Irish language translation, and all of those books are available pretty much anywhere books are sold. I feel like a commercial saying that, but
well, that's it's all part of it.
Yep. I do have a Patreon, which is a good amount of free material. So for people who, are not in a position to sign up to pay for something like that, I do put a lot of free material on it. I think it's important. I mean, I do have obviously material that costs money, books and such, but I do try to put a good amount of free material out because I realize not everyone's in a position, financially. I do have a blog.
Where can we find that one?
My blog is called Living Liminally. Surprising after I talked all about liminality, which is a wonderful word. So if you just search like Morgan Daimler living liminally, any spelling of that, there's a lot of L's, I know. It'll come up. And I do teach paid courses through the Irish Pagan School. So, and those would all be on fairies and related subjects. So
thank you so much for joining me today. It's been great.
Thank you for having me. It was a great conversation.
It was for me too. That brings us to the end of another exciting episode of My Side of the Crystal Ball. My very special thanks to Morgan Daimler for sharing all her interesting ideas and information about fairies and elementals and ghosts, and what a fascinating show. Thank you very much. Just before we say goodbye, have that request again. If you're watching us on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Subscribing to our channel makes us higher up in the ratings, and we're just a little past 100,000 subscribers. Our ratings are going up, so please subscribe. It'll just help us so much. And by the way, you can find us also on Apple, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere else you are listening to your podcast. And very shortly, we've got a big announcement about where you're going to be able to see us and hear us as well. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can find me on my website, www.robertlindsymilne.com. You can find me on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. And if you're interested in a reading or life coaching or whatever, I'm still doing that. And now, just before I say goodnight, do good, stay safe, and above all, just be kind. Good night, everybody.